So before I start tearing into this, here's what my starter sounds like. Granted, it's kind of a cold day here. Bike's never been started, but here's what it sounds like. A little bit of grinding noise and basically just a non-start. And probably a lot of you guys hearing the same thing. So I have all the mods done. So here's what it sounds like now when I go to start it up. So here's the first step. Just take this cover off. That'll give you access to the ignition cover, and here's the starter right here. First thing you do is obviously disconnect the ground on the battery, and then I'll go and unhook the power to here, to the starter itself. So at this point I've taken a couple of bolts off the ignition cover, and then there's two bolts here hold the starter on, and then you just rotate this and the starter just comes right out. There's just O-ring that holds that in place. Okay, so at this point I've removed all the bolts that hold the ignition cover on. You can leave this one in, it just holds this outer cover on. And you do want to keep track of those bolts, where they go, because they are a bunch of different lengths, and it's kind of a pain when you're putting it back together if you haven't kept track of which bolts go in which holes. So at this point all the bolts are out, and you can just pull this cover off. Make sure the gasket isn't coming off with it and getting torn. You'd have to replace that. You'll feel some resistance. It's just the magnets inside causing some resistance. Might have to push the lever down a little bit to clear, and then we have there, just off to the side. You can just rest it there. The wiring harness kind of hold it up in place, and you can see here's our infamous Bendix right here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's where the Bendix is. Here it engages with this starter gear here, or the gears on the flywheel, and then up here is where the Bendix, I'll get a better view of it, but that's where it resides in the side case. So here's the Ktm Bendix, and the way this works is as the starter engages, it spins the body, and the theory is that it spins it fast enough that this is kind of is slow to turn, so it will slide out on the Bendix, and then that will engage with the gears on the flywheel. And that's all well and good. If the starter spins this fast enough, this will go out and engage with the flywheel. But typically what happens is it maybe doesn't spin it fast enough, it doesn't accelerate that out to where I can go out and grab the gears, or the gears bounce off each other. And that's why you get this infamous two-stroke where it sounds like it goes out and it pops back and then just freewheels. It's because this thing can't get all the way out to engage on the flywheel, or it bounces off the gears. And so the key thing with the KTM starters is to get this spinning as fast as you can, as quick as you can, so this Bendix gear will expand and engage the flywheel. And so obviously the enemy of that is friction. So one of the key things, you know, in reducing this friction is opening this up, and you just flush out right in here. You put a hose, you know, a WD-40 or silicone grease, and spray that out and flush any debris out of there and lubricate. You don't want to put grease in there because that is sticky and prevents a smooth movement of this Bendix actuating. On either end of the Bendix, there is these little collars. They're replaceable. They're about $1.25 or so each, and they're Teflon coated. They go on here. The Bendix, the little nub there, just resides in these little collars, and that's supposed to reduce the friction. There's two of these. One is in the side of the case right here. You see where that screwdriver is pointing to, and you can pull those out and replace them, and that will reduce the friction. The other one is in the side case right here. And again, you can just get one and replace those. So those things, the coating wears out, and then they start expanding, and then eventually you get a bunch of friction from that Bendix riding in there without adequate lubrication. So now I've taken this cover off, and this is where this transfer gear resides. You can see this. So the starter gear engages on this outer ring, and then the inner gear drives the Bendix. So you do want to put grease on there to reduce friction. And those same collars that we saw for the Bendix, there's one in here, and again, these are replaceable. There's one in here, and then there's also one in the outside cover. Again, you can replace these, and they're Teflon coated. Once they start wearing out and stretching, you're going to get more friction, or the gears are not going to mesh correctly and cause some binding. Okay, so I've got this starter apart, or I've taken the two bolts out that hold the starter together, just so you can see. And then this outer housing comes apart. Then this is one of the other problem areas that I found. There's a roller bearing in there, and when I first took this apart, those needles in that bearing were just rusted up. There's no seal on the outside. I don't think there's any grease put in from the beginning, and I subsequently greased it up, but I'm going to have to replace the bearing in here. I've gotten a kit from Rick's Motorsports that's got a new armature, bearing, everything you need to rebuild this starter. There's a video on the internet by Slavens Racing that gives you a step-by-step of how to repair one of these starters, and so you can go out and look at that one to get a step-by-step instruction. But the main thing that I'm trying to do is to reduce the amount of friction in this starter, make sure there's no binding, trying to get that Bendix to be able to open up as fast as possible and engage that flywheel. And hopefully I'll have some success with that. So here's a look. I have the base off now, and you can see here's the brushes, and they start life, and you can see they're considerably longer than that. So what happens is, as these starters get more and more friction, they are in the mechanism, it engages less and less often, so you end up trying to start it more often. And so each time if you try and start it 6 times before it starts, then obviously you're wearing the brushes, you're causing wear on all the gears, those Teflon collars and so on. And so just it's a vicious cycle. You get more friction in there, it doesn't engage as often, so you end up cycling the starter more, which then causes the brushes to start wearing, and then you get into the point where you're getting more resistance in the starter. So before it was friction, now it's electrical resistance starts building up, and so that's why this it's kind of a cascading effect of all these subsystems, that as you get more friction, you get more resistance, you end up cycling it more, and just it just like I say, it's a vicious cycle. So this shows the new bushing on the right hand side versus the old bushing, and you can see a pretty dramatic difference on the left hand side. It's worn quite a bit, worn unevenly, probably not making a good contact patch. It doesn't help anything as far as getting the electricity through the motor. I took the housing down to the machine shop, and they pressed the bearing in and the seal. It cost me like $5. This other bushing that comes in the repair kit, Slavens shows you how to drill the existing one out and then press this new one in. The machine shop said he couldn't do it, so I checked. I put the shaft in the new armature in there and checked. There really wasn't that much play, so I'm just going to leave the old one in there rather than risking screwing up the housing myself. I don't think there's that much wear at all, so I think I'm pretty much good to go. I'm just putting this all back together, and I got the one brush in already. It goes together pretty straightforward. Definitely check out the video of Slavens doing this. Shows a really good trick of using tweezers to hold the brushes in place while you put the armature in. Otherwise, it's just a nightmare to try and manipulate all that at once. A great trick there. I've used it already once. So anyway, I just wanted to show this that Slavens trick with the tweezers holding the brushes in works just like it shows, and it's very slick. Probably about the only way you can get this thing together. So I'm going to do the Slavens Wet Mod also, and well, let me show you. Here's the other collar, and this is where the other end of the Bendix rides. You can see the collar in there. You can replace that little Teflon collar, and it's pretty easy to do. Just some reverse snap ring pliers. I'm also going to do the Slavens Wet Mod, and what you do is there's a little drain hole in the bottom of the ignition cover. What you do is you plug that up, and what that allows you to do then is to put a small amount of oil, I think it says 2 to 4 ounces of oil in this cover. Now some people worry about oil on ignition coil. Well, 4-stroke motors have an oil bath on the ignition coil, so it doesn't hurt them at all. And what this does then is you have a small amount of oil down in here. As the flywheel turns, it sits there and it splashes the oil and lubricates all these different parts, and I'm sure it gets up into the starter bearing. I mentioned that was the real culprit here. That went dry. It was probably never even oiled from the factory. So when you block off the drain hole here, you still have to vent this. And so what I've done is again, there's videos by Slavens on all this stuff, and I've done the vent mod. And what you do is there's the grommet where the wires come through to your stator, and I just drilled a small hole here. I got a short fitting down at Napa and some tubing, drilled a hole here, inserted that little fitting, and it'll clear everything, and that allows for no buildup of pressure, and vents out moisture too when the motor heats up. Probably a good idea to put that in there when you block this other drain hole. One other thing to check is there's a technical bullet out from KTM about this, and you can shim this gear, and you should check this, and it shouldn't move more than 1/2 tooth distance, and mine seems to be fine. If there's more movement than that, you put shims in to get the lash, is what you call it, adjusted to the correct amount. If it's out of adjustment, then the gear contact patch is wrong, and you can probably get some binding. They say this adjustment cures a lot of the problems also with these starters. Okay, so I've got the cover back on, and I haven't put the starter back in here yet, but you can see the wiring harness here. What I like to do is to take some silicone, and it's just some blue RTV silicone, and smear it all around the grommet and around the wire. Just make sure there's a good seal. It's right up at the front of the motor. You get a ton of spray from your front tire, and just want to make sure that there's no water getting in here. Especially after I've done the Slavens mod and filled this case up with oil, or put 4 ounces of oil in there. Last thing I want is a bunch of water mixing with that, and then getting churned up and thrown all over the metal components in there. So definitely want to make sure that is sealed up here, because that's your main place where you're going to get some contaminants coming into that side cover. So there you can see I've slathered a bunch of blue RTV silicone all around there, and it doesn't look pretty, but nobody sees this anyway. It's behind the cover for the starter, and behind the exhaust. It'd be near impossible to even anybody see it, so better to just have a bunch all glopped on there and keep the water out. Okay, so at this point, cover's on. I've got this vent line, and what I did was I've run that up the chassis, and then up along here, and then a long loop back down, and I like the vent loop to point down. I think it's probably best. That way you don't, there's less chance of anything getting sucked down into it because it's pointing down. So there's no real vacuum to pull stuff up. So as long as it's pointing down, nothing can, leak down in through the vent line. So that's the reason for that. So I've taken the battery out, and you can see there's quite a bit of space right down here between the air filter and the bottom of the stock battery case in the air box. Okay, so at this point I've taken the battery holder cage out, and all you see is the bare inner fender. You can also see the coolant recovery mod I did. That's this little squeeze bottle that's got the overflow, runs into it and back out. This inner fender though, where I had the mount, you can see here's a comparison of the two battery cages. On the right hand is the stock side and the stock battery there. This is the battery holder out of the 4-stroke, and it's just a little bit taller. It's a little bit taller up in here. And you can also see likewise the battery is taller also. What I did was to make sure that there wouldn't be any problems putting this cage in. I wanted the holes to be exactly the same, the mounting holes. So what I did was I made sure that this inner fender was the same part number on both my 2-stroke and the 450. So that way I knew the mounting hole spacing would be exactly the same and I wouldn't have any problems with that. So the stock holder on the right, the stock battery is about 50 amps, amp hours, or cold cranking amps. The one on the left is for 4-stroke, and it has a slightly larger battery that's 70 cold cranking amps. But you can get this battery is actually an upgrade on that, and it's 130 cold cranking amps. So I'm going from 50 cold cranking amps with the stock battery with the 4-stroke battery holder, which is designed for a 70 amp battery. I'm actually putting a 130 amp battery in there. It cost me about $70 for that battery, about $30 more than stock. So here's a chart that shows how this conversion works. So you can see the stock motorcycle, my motorcycle, 250XCW, the battery holder, this thing, the stock one is this part number. And what I did was I found a 450 EXC that uses this larger cage, which then that battery is a slightly larger battery, and you can see the amps and the dimensions. And so what the conversion does is you put the bigger battery cage in from a 450 EXC that stock has a slightly larger battery, but then what you really do is you put this next size up battery, and you can see that it has the stock battery's 50 cold cranking amps, and this one is 130. And so that's the goal, is put this different battery cage in, which allows you to put this much larger or higher capacity battery in, but the dimensions are the same between this larger ultra capacity one and the one that fits in this battery cage. And as a cross check, I made sure that where this battery cage mounts to, which is this inner fender part, that on both bikes it's the same inner fender. So I know there's gonna be no mounting issues of bolting this cage into my bike because they both use the same inner fender. So at this point I've got the new battery box mounted up, and the wires all rerouted. So here it is, the battery's now installed. You can see it sticks up a little bit. I did trial fit the seat, and there's enough clearance in the bottom of the seat. There's actually a recess, and the cable just barely touched the bottom of the seat, so everything should be good.